So Christian apologists have a lot of arguments for God's existence. A lot. But you may have noticed they're actually kind of low on arguments for Christianity. When addressing skeptics, they usually defend some very abstract concept of God that isn't necessarily identical with the God of the Bible. One attempt to go further and actually defend the specific historical claims of their religion is the minimal facts approach to the resurrection, originated by Gary Habermas. It is an attempt to argue, based on well-established and accepted historical facts, that Jesus rose from the dead. Or sometimes they say that God raised Jesus from the dead. I mean, those aren't the same thing. If Jesus was resurrected, he could have been resurrected by God or the devil or a necromancer, aliens, time travelers, the power of love, but never mind that. If apologists can prove that he rose from the dead at all, that would still be a huge step forward for Christianity. So can they do it? No, of course not. In this video, I'll be drawing mainly from Mike Licona's debate with Matt Dillahunty, William Lane Craig's debate with Bart Ehrman, and William Lane Craig's two-part video series, Did Jesus Rise from the Dead?, all of which present minimal facts arguments for the resurrection. I'd recommend you watch at least one of these. The last one is by far the shortest if you just want to get a sense of how the argument works. All three present slightly different versions of the argument, and I'll be attending to some of those differences, but they're basically similar. So the minimal facts approach begins with a list of propositions like, Jesus' tomb was found empty, Paul was anti-Christian, but then he converted, that are taken to be historically evidenced beyond dispute. Many responses to these arguments focus on disputing these, and that is certainly valid. Many of these so-called facts aren't nearly as well established as apologists would like you to believe, but I'm going to steer away from that and focus on what I think are more fundamental problems with the approach. So for the sake of argument, I'm going to grant every claim on every list in the videos I mentioned, and yes, they are all different lists.
There are four historical facts which must be explained by any adequate historical hypothesis: Jesus' burial, the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. In this case, the evidence is relatively uncontroversial, as we'll see it's agreed to by most scholars.
There are three main facts that need to be explained: the discovery of Jesus' empty tomb, the appearances of Jesus alive after his death, and the disciples' belief that Jesus rose from the dead.
So our historical bedrock that we get from this, again, this is virtually undisputed in the world of scholarship, no matter if you're an atheist, agnostic, Jewish, or Christian scholar. A number of Jesus' disciples believed the risen Jesus appeared to them. These experiences occurred in individual and in group settings. And third, the skeptic Paul became a Christian when he had an experience he believed was the risen Jesus appearing to him. And I would tell you, virtually 99% of scholars grant these today.
The apologist then appeals to a concept called abduction, or inference to the best explanation. This is where you have a set of evidence and you infer the theory that best explains that evidence.
Did Jesus rise from the dead? As we explore this question, we need to address two further questions. What are the facts that require explanation? And which explanation best accounts for these facts?
So what do we do with method? Well, the mechanism that historians use to determine what's probable, every discipline has something different, but historians use historical method, arguments of inference to the best explanation.
And I hope to show tonight that the resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation of certain well-established facts about Jesus.
First, I want to talk a bit about how Craig uses inference to the best explanation. Note that Licona concludes his argument with,
Bottom line, my two major contentions. Empirical data strongly suggests that reality has a supernatural dimension, and historical data strongly suggests that Jesus rose from the dead.
While Craig summarizes his as,
I've argued first that there are four historical facts which any adequate historical hypothesis must account for, and that second, the best explanation of those facts is that Jesus rose from the dead.
You notice the difference? Maybe it's just my imagination, but he seems to tiptoe around ever saying that the evidence for the resurrection is strong, or conclusive, or anything like that. Instead, just comparing it as an explanation to other explanations. His Did Jesus Rise from the Dead video ends like this.
But is this explanation plausible? After all, it requires a miracle, a supernatural act of God. Think about it. If it's even possible that God exists, then miracles are possible, and this explanation cannot be ruled out. And surely it's possible that God exists. So how do you explain the resurrection?
Why doesn't he say that the resurrection is highly plausible? Instead, all he says is that it's possible and therefore cannot be ruled out. The implication being that since those other hypotheses have been ruled out, one must accept the resurrection. It's process of elimination, right? This is persuasive because it bears a resemblance to a logically valid argument of the form A or B or C or D or E, not A, not B, not C, not D, therefore E. But since we're talking about an historic event, we're dealing with probabilities, not absolute truth values. So the real form of the argument is A or B or C or D or E, probably not A, probably not B, probably not C, probably not D, therefore probably E. But that simply isn't how it works. Imagine the probability of each of these potential explanations is distributed like this. A through D are all pretty improbable, but we would be wrong to conclude that E is probable. It's not even at 50%. And of course, in reality, there are a lot more than 5 theories we could come up with for what happened with Jesus. So even if competing explanations are individually quite weak in comparison to the resurrection hypothesis, they might be strong enough together to overpower it, like an anime about friendship or something. But soft! Craig has already answered a similar objection on his website, put to him a year ago by one Gunter from Germany, who says, "The best explanation does not imply that the explanation is the true one, nor that we are rationally compelled to accept it, nor that we should believe it." Thanks, Gunter. I want to focus first on paragraphs 2 and 3 of Craig's response, which I think are the most relevant. In paragraph 2, he pretty much agrees with what we've already said. You're quite right that, theoretically speaking, being the best explanation is not enough to show that the explanation is true and deserving of assent. All of the hypotheses could be improbable, so that each one is more probably false than true. Suppose H1 has a probability of 36%, while H2 has a probability of 33%, and H3 has a probability of 31%. Then, even if H1 is the best explanation, it is probably not true, and so should not be embraced. Glad to hear we're on the same page. But he goes on. In practice, however, such a situation would be rare. It would. That's news to me. Since a hypothesis having great explanatory power, explanatory scope, plausibility, etc., and so exceeding its rivals in these explanatory virtues that it is unlikely that any of them would come to exceed it, is probably true as well as the best. I think that this is, in particular, the case with Jesus' resurrection. It's not just the best explanation of a bad lot, it is a really good explanation. Well, I'm glad he finally says unequivocally that the resurrection is a good explanation, not just the best. Although somewhere along the line we seem to slip from talking about merely the best explanation to one that far excels its rivals. But even an explanation like that isn't necessarily probable, as we saw in the earlier example. Just one more thing. At the beginning of the post I was just reading from, Craig says, quote, "In his classic, Inference to the Best Explanation, 2004, Peter Lipton deals with this very question, so you may want to look at what he has to say there." Well, I have read Lipton's Inference to the Best Explanation, specifically the 2004 edition Craig is referring to, and Lipton does address this question, and what he says basically lines up with what Craig says in the next paragraph, that is, the part where he agrees with me and Gunter. Let's read. So this is from Chapter 4. So the account, that is Lipton's account of Inference to the Best Explanation, allows us to infer more than one explanation. It also allows us to infer fewer. As I have already suggested in passing, although best suggests existence, the account clearly should be construed so as to allow that we infer none of the potential explanations we have come up with, since they may all be too weak. The best explanation must be good enough to merit inference. Inference to the best explanation must allow for agnosticism. And when he says agnosticism, he's not talking specifically in a religious context. He means agnosticism about anything. On the other hand, to my recollection, nothing in this book supports the rest of Craig's response. That is, the part where he actually defends the resurrection against this objection. So if Gunter was to do as Craig recommends and see what Lipton has to say about this question in this book, I think he would just find that Lipton agrees with him. So I'm just a little confused why Craig gave this recommendation. I mean, there are a few potential explanations for it. Maybe he wants Gunter and his other readers to learn more about the subject, regardless of what conclusions they form. Maybe there is something in the book that supports Craig's position and I've just forgotten about it, although in that case, it would be nice if he gave some clue what it was. Maybe Craig has it confused with a different book. Or, possibly. It's just name-dropping. And there's no purpose to mentioning the book other than to flex his erudition before an audience that he doesn't expect to actually read it. So it doesn't matter how it relates to his argument. In fact, I think that might just be, dare I say it, the best explanation. But that doesn't mean it's true. You see, we just came full circle, and that's the main takeaway here. That inference to the best explanation, properly applied, doesn't mean you always infer the best explanation, as counterintuitive as that sounds. Finding the best explanation is not the whole story, and it's entirely valid not to support any explanation because sometimes events are just unexplained. The evidence is inconclusive. This is the case with many events in history, especially ancient history, including, I will argue, the circumstances surrounding Jesus' purported resurrection. But it's often demanded that skeptics provide and defend their own alternatives to the resurrection.
In order to explain that the resurrection is improbable, he needs not only to tear down all of the evidence for the resurrection, but he needs to erect a positive case of his own in favor of some naturalistic alternatives.
And then they throw out some wild speculation, which is all anyone can really do, and get hit with this.
Now he says, well, look at these other hypotheses. Perhaps, for example, family members of Jesus stole the body. Isn't that more probable? Well, I don't think so. Notice there's no motive in that case for stealing the body. The family members of Jesus didn't believe in him during his lifetime. Nobody else other than Joseph and his servants and the women disciples even knew where the body had been interred. The time was insufficient for such a conspiracy to be hatched and launched between Friday night and Sunday morning. Also, the grave clothes in the tomb disprove the hypothesis of tomb robbery. Nobody would undress the body before taking it away. His conspiracies like this always come to light. His Roman cards have been happy to inform the Jewish figures of what had happened. And this hypothesis can't explain either the appearances of Jesus nor the origin of the Christian belief in his resurrection. So for all those reasons, that's an improbable hypothesis.
It's incredible that Craig can be so cool and logical when dissecting the problems of one hypothesis, while taking for granted, of course, so many details from the gospel narratives, and then turn around and say, therefore, guy came back from the dead. No problem with that theory, right? In my next video, I'll be arguing why the resurrection isn't a good explanation, particularly why it lacks plausibility.